A 3-year-old boy in Sri Lanka tells his mother he has a different name. He describes a house in a village he has never visited. He names his wife. He names his children. He describes how he died. His mother takes him to the village. The house exists. The family exists. The man whose life he is describing died before the boy was born. And the details, specific, verifiable, impossible to have learned, match. This is not a story from a spiritual text. This is a case file from the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia. One of more than 2,500 cases collected by researchers over the last 60 years. Cases in which children, almost always between the ages of 2 and 7, spontaneously describe memories of a life that is not theirs. A life that, in a significant number of cases, can be verified. The question is not whether this happens. It happens. The question is what it means. And the scientific answer, the one that comes not from religion or tradition, but from 60 years of systematic research, is one of the most carefully hedged, most rigorously documented, and most genuinely unresolved questions in the whole of human psychology. Let's start with what the research actually shows, because most people who dismiss past life memories as superstition have never read the primary literature, and the primary literature is considerably stranger than the dismissal suggests. Ian Stevenson was a psychiatrist at the University of Virginia who spent 40 years, from the 1960s until his death in 2007, systematically investigating reports of children who appeared to remember previous lives. He was not a mystic. He was not a believer in any particular religious or spiritual tradition. He was a methodologist. His research protocols were designed to eliminate the most obvious alternative explanations: coaching by parents, information the child could have learned normally, cultural suggestion, and to document what remained when those explanations were removed. What remained, across more than 2,000 cases, was a pattern consistent enough to require explanation. Children typically begin making past life statements between the ages of 2 and 4. They typically stop between the ages of 5 and 8. The statements are often specific: names, places, relationships, causes of death. In approximately 30% of investigated cases, the previous personality can be identified: a real person who lived and died, whose life matches the details the child has provided. In many of these cases, the child had no normal means of access to the information they described. Stevenson documented a further detail that has become one of the most discussed and least explained findings in this body of research. Children who claim to remember dying violently in a previous life frequently bear birthmarks or birth defects that correspond to the wounds that caused the death. A child claiming to have been shot in the chest may have a birthmark in the location of the entry wound. A child claiming to have been killed by a blade may have a linear mark corresponding to the wound. Stevenson collected more than 200 such cases, cross-referencing the physical marks against post-mortem records where available. In 49 cases, he was able to obtain the death documents for the previous personality and confirm that the wounds matched the birthmarks. This finding, the birthmark evidence, is the most contentious in the entire literature, because it suggests not merely that information transfers between lives, but that the physical body somehow retains or reflects the experience of a previous body. And that is a claim that has no place in any current model of biology, genetics, or physics. It requires either a complete revision of what we understand about how bodies develop, or an explanation that nobody has yet been able to provide. The research did not stop with Stevenson. Jim Tucker, also at the University of Virginia, has continued and extended the work, with particular focus on American cases that are harder to explain through cultural suggestion in a country where reincarnation is not a dominant belief. Tucker's 2005 book and subsequent research have documented cases that follow the same pattern as Stevenson's international cases, which is significant because it suggests the phenomenon is not culturally produced. Children in Virginia, and children in Sri Lanka, and children in Lebanon are describing the same type of experience with the same structure and the same specific features, despite growing up in radically different cultures with radically different relationships to the idea of reincarnation. Tucker has proposed what he calls a model of non-local consciousness to explain the data. The idea that consciousness is not entirely produced by the brain, but exists in some form that can persist beyond the death of the body and attach to a new body at birth. He is careful to note that this is a hypothesis, not a conclusion. conclusion. The data requires an explanation. This is one possible explanation. It is not the only one, because there are other explanations, and they are worth taking seriously. The first and most obvious is selective reporting, the possibility that the cases that get investigated and documented are the ones that work out, while the far larger number of children who make past life statements that cannot be verified go unrecorded. This is a genuine methodological challenge. The research group acknowledges it. The bias, if it exists, would inflate the apparent rate of verification. The second alternative explanation is cryptomnesia, the phenomenon in which information learned and forgotten is later experienced as original knowledge. A child who overhears a conversation about a deceased local person might later produce details about that person's life while having no conscious memory of hearing them. The information was in the brain. The source was forgotten. The experience of retrieving it feels like remembering something that cannot have been learned. Cryptomnesia is real. It is well documented. The question is whether it can explain all the cases, including the ones where researchers have specifically investigated and failed to find any plausible source of normal information. The third alternative is something more fundamental. We do not fully understand how memory works. We do not fully understand how consciousness works. We do not fully understand the relationship between the brain and experience. The most honest position in the philosophy of mind is that consciousness is one of the least understood phenomena in all of science. The hard problem of consciousness, as David Chalmers named it, remains genuinely unsolved. In that context, the assumption that consciousness cannot persist beyond death is not a scientific conclusion. It is an assumption. It is the most parsimonious assumption, but it has not been proven. What makes the past life research unusual in the landscape of anomalous claims is the quality of the methodology. Stevenson and Tucker are not credulous. They are not motivated reasoners. Stevenson's work in particular has been read carefully by critics, including Carl Sagan, who was famously skeptical of virtually all paranormal claims. And Sagan wrote that the past life research was one of 3 claims in the entire paranormal field that he thought deserved serious scientific investigation, not because he believed it, because the methodology was rigorous enough that dismissal without engagement was intellectually dishonest. The cases that are hardest to dismiss follow a specific pattern. The child is young, 2 or 3, before they could have systematically learned the information. The previous personality is identified after the child makes the statements, not before, eliminating the possibility that parents researched a specific person and coached the child toward details. The child demonstrates knowledge that was not in any public record accessible to the family. The child shows emotional responses, grief for a deceased spouse, recognition of family members they have never met that go beyond what could be explained by verbal instruction. And in the strongest cases, the child bears physical marks that correspond to the death of the previous personality. None of this proves reincarnation. The researchers say this clearly and repeatedly. Proof in the philosophical sense may be impossible here, the way it is impossible in many questions about consciousness and subjective experience. What the research establishes is that the phenomenon is real, something is happening, and that the most common dismissals are insufficient to explain the strongest cases. There is a case that Tucker has described as among the most striking in the American collection. A boy in the American South around age 4 begins describing a life as a Hollywood extra in the 1930s. He identifies a photograph of himself from that life from a group photograph, a photograph he had never seen, pointing at one figure in a crowd of hundreds and saying, "That is me." He describes the name of the man, his agent, the street where he lived, the film he appeared in. Researchers trace the details. The man existed. The agent existed. The street existed. The film existed. The boy had never been to Hollywood. His family had no connection to the film industry. The man whose life he described died decades before the boy was born. And the boy, when asked about the details, described them not as things he had been told, but as things he remembered. The texture of remembering, not of reporting. The difference between those two things is something we all recognize. And in children who describe past lives, researchers consistently report that the quality of the statements has the texture of genuine memory, personal, specific, emotionally charged, rather than the texture of repeated information. What do we do with this? As people trying to understand the world accurately, the honest answer is that we hold it carefully. We don't dismiss it because it is uncomfortable. We don't accept it because it is compelling. We recognize that the data exists, that it has been collected rigorously, that it has resisted the most obvious alternative explanations, and that it points at questions about consciousness and personal identity that are genuinely open. Questions that matter. Questions that the most sophisticated philosophers and neuroscientists in the world have not resolved. The children stop talking about their previous lives, almost always, between the ages of 5 and 8. The memories fade the way other early memories fade. Life takes over. The present becomes more vivid than the past, and by the time they are adults, most of them remember very little of what they described so clearly when they were 3. The details that were once so precise, the name, the village, the family, the death, dissolve into a vague sense that something happened once, somewhere, that was real in a way they can no longer access. Maybe that is what we all carry. A past that fades precisely when life begins to feel permanent, and a present that will one day be someone else's impossible memory.